The greatest civilizations did not fall because they forgot how to build. They fell because they forgot who they were building for. The first thing anyone noticed about Kestrel Ridge was not the forest, but the silence. Towering trees stretched nearly 800 feet into a pale silver sky, their immense trunks rising like living pillars older than recorded history. Morning light filtered through countless layers of emerald leaves, breaking into ribbons that drifted across the moss-covered ground, while a cool breeze carried the scent of cedar, rain, and fresh earth. Hidden among those colossal branches was something so ordinary that visiting scholars almost missed it. It was a treehouse, built from local timber, polished by careful hands instead of industrial drones. It rested naturally within the embrace of one ancient tree as though it had always belonged there. There were no shimmering force fields, no anti-gravity supports, no quantum anchors glowing beneath polished metal. Only warm wood, braided rope, sturdy beams, broad windows, and a front porch where two children laughed while swinging their feet over the edge. Ethan Walker tightened the final bolt on a hand-carved railing and stepped back with a quiet smile. At 34, he had designed research stations on frozen moons and emergency shelters on frontier colonies. But this small project mattered more to him than any government contract. The children of Kestrel Ridge needed a place where imagination could climb higher than fear. They needed a place that felt alive. Above the forest canopy, 6 sleek starships descended without making a sound. Their mirrored hulls reflected the morning sun, as if the sky itself had fractured into floating pieces of silver. The vessels belonged to the Galactic Habitat Authority, the most respected architectural institution in explored space. Entire civilizations waited decades for one official inspection from its architects. Today they had come to evaluate humanity's newest frontier settlement. Ethan barely glanced upward. He brushed sawdust from his sleeves and checked the final support beam one more time before welcoming the first children across the narrow wooden bridge. They rushed inside with delighted laughter, filling every corner with footsteps, excitement, and endless questions about secret rooms and lookout windows. Their voices echoed softly through the branches, blending with birdsong until the entire forest seemed to breathe together. A polished transport descended onto a nearby clearing, its seamless door unfolding with mathematical precision. Several alien architects emerged wearing elegant white uniforms trimmed with subtle strands of luminous metal. Their movements were graceful, measured, almost rehearsed. At their center walked Lysra Vale. Her ivory skin carried the faint shimmer of pearl beneath the sunlight, while champagne-colored hair rested neatly across one shoulder. Her golden eyes swept across the settlement with calm confidence, recording every structure in perfect detail. Then she stopped. Her attention settled on the treehouse. One silent second passed. Then another. One architect quietly adjusted his scanner before speaking with unmistakable disbelief. Primitive recreational shelter. Structural rating estimated at 0.7. Inefficient materials. Unoptimized geometry. Several others exchanged restrained smiles. One actually laughed. Lysra never joined them, but neither did she defend the little structure resting peacefully among the branches. She simply continued studying it, watching children race across the wooden bridge without hesitation, listening to laughter rise into the enormous canopy, while every advanced sensor in her possession insisted that nothing about the design should have worked as beautifully as it did. The inspection lasted less than 12 minutes before the conclusions began appearing across dozens of transparent displays. Every building in the settlement received a numerical score, a structural probability index, and a projection for long-term sustainability. The laboratories ranked exceptionally high. The solar arrays exceeded galactic efficiency standards by nearly 12%. Even the water purification network earned several approving remarks from the visiting specialists. Only one structure remained highlighted in amber instead of green. The treehouse. Ethan leaned against the weathered fence surrounding a small vegetable garden while watching the architects quietly exchange data. He did not seem offended. Years of working on frontier worlds had taught him that advanced civilizations often trusted numbers long before they trusted people. One younger architect stepped closer to the tree, activated a floating scanner, and frowned. The display refused to stabilize. Flexible load distribution exceeded predicted variance. Organic support movement detected. Material expansion inconsistent. Structural equation unresolved. Another architect looked over the report before shaking his head with polite amusement. Primitive construction methods frequently produce random anomalies. The scanner will recalibrate. Lysera remained silent. Her golden eyes followed the children instead of the numbers. Every few moments, one of them leaned over the wooden railing to wave at friends below before racing toward another corner of the treehouse. The entire structure responded with almost invisible movement, swaying gently with the breeze instead of resisting it. It looked less like a building and more like another living branch. An elderly colonist carrying fresh apples approached Ethan with an easy smile. "Beautiful morning, is it not?" Ethan accepted one of the apples and nodded. "Best weather we have had all month." The old man glanced toward the visitors. They do not seem impressed. Ethan laughed quietly. They do not have to be. The tree only needs to impress the people living around it. Several architects overheard the exchange. One politely cleared his throat. Functional architecture exists to maximize efficiency. Emotional preference is considered secondary. Ethan turned toward him without the slightest hint of argument. Maybe that is where we see things differently. He looked back toward the children. A home should lower your heartbeat before it raises your productivity. For a brief moment, nobody answered. The words did not fit inside any recognized engineering model. One architect entered the sentence into his translator twice, assuming an error had occurred. Lysera did not. She simply watched Ethan as though trying to determine whether he genuinely believed what he had just said. A gentle breeze drifted through the branches. The wooden bridge creaked softly beneath tiny footsteps. Sunlight danced across polished rails worn smooth by countless curious hands. Nothing about the scene appeared technologically remarkable, yet nothing felt accidental either. Every angle welcomed movement. Every window framed the surrounding forest instead of hiding it. Every board carried subtle marks left by tools rather than fabrication machines. Lysera slowly climbed the first few steps leading toward the entrance. She placed one hand against the warm cedar railing. Her scanner immediately projected hundreds of microscopic readings across her vision. Moisture levels, fiber density, natural stress patterns, biological growth. Everything suggested imperfection. Yet beneath the endless columns of statistical flaws appeared something her instruments struggled to classify. The entire structure continuously adjusted itself alongside the tree. Minute by minute, breath by breath, wind by wind. No artificial stabilization system had been installed because the tree itself had become the stabilization system. Lysera lowered her scanner without realizing it. For the first time since arriving on Kestrel Ridge, she stopped measuring the treehouse and simply stood there listening as children laughed above her, while the ancient tree answered with a quiet whisper carried through every living branch. The afternoon settled over Kestrel Ridge with the slow confidence of a place that had learned patience from the forest itself. Warm lights spilled through the towering canopy, painting shifting patterns across the settlement as every branch moved almost too gently to notice. The inspection teams continued recording measurements, comparing calculations, and debating efficiencies, while Ethan Walker quietly repaired a loose section of the wooden bridge with nothing more than a hand tool and fresh cedar pegs. He worked without hurry because nothing in the forest ever benefited from rushing. High above the colony, a low vibration rolled across the sky. Several colonists instinctively looked upward. One elderly woman smiled instead of worrying. "Storm season," she whispered. "It arrives early this year." Lysera followed her gaze. Her wrist display immediately illuminated with streams of atmospheric data. A magnetic resonance front was forming beyond the eastern mountains, accelerating faster than local weather models had predicted. It was not dangerous by galactic standards, but it carried powerful oscillating wind currents capable of exposing weaknesses in poorly balanced structures. One of the visiting architects glanced toward the settlement with calm confidence. "The colony will provide useful resilience data. Automated systems will compensate accordingly." Across the clearing, sleek research towers quietly activated stabilization fields. Thin rings of blue light shimmered around observation platforms. Sensor masts adjusted their orientation with mechanical precision. Every advanced structure prepared itself to resist the coming disturbance. Ethan noticed none of the displays. Instead, he looked toward the children still playing inside the treehouse. "The leaves have started turning over," he said softly. They should head home soon. A little girl leaned over the porch railing and laughed. 5 more minutes, Mr. Walker. He smiled. 4. The first gust arrived without warning. It swept through the ancient forest with a deep rushing sound, bending enormous branches until sunlight flickered wildly across the ground below. The research towers answered immediately. Stabilizers increased power. Anchor systems compensated. Diagnostic alerts flashed across every inspection display. Another gust followed, stronger than the first. Metallic supports emitted low mechanical hums as automatic correction systems worked continuously to maintain perfect alignment. Then something unexpected happened. The oldest observation platform began vibrating. At first the movement was almost invisible. Then coffee cups inside the laboratory trembled. Wall panels rattled. Several architects exchanged puzzled looks while new warnings appeared across their instruments. Harmonic feedback detected. Structural resonance increasing. Probability of oscillation escalation. One engineer hurried toward the control console. Increase stabilizer output by 15%. The platform responded exactly as commanded. The vibration became stronger. Ethan quietly watched the tall structure shiver against the wind before turning his attention back toward the children crossing the wooden bridge one by one. Nobody panicked. Nobody ran. They simply followed familiar instructions they had practiced every storm season. The final child stepped onto solid ground just as another powerful wave of wind swept through the valley. Above them, the treehouse moved. It did not resist. It leaned with the ancient trunk, drifting several inches before returning almost gracefully to its original position. The ropes flexed. The beams absorbed the motion. Every joint seemed to understand exactly where the force wanted to travel. There was no struggle, only cooperation. Lysera stood perfectly still as her scanner attempted to explain what her eyes already understood. Every prediction failed. Every simulation expected instability. Yet the living structure remained remarkably calm because it was never trying to overpower the storm. It had surrendered to it long before the first gust had even arrived. Around her, sophisticated equipment worked harder with every passing second. Above her, a simple wooden treehouse seemed to grow quieter the stronger the wind became. For the first time in her distinguished career, Lysera realized that perhaps the greatest mistake an architect could make was believing that strength and resistance were always the same thing. The wind faded as gradually as it had arrived, leaving behind a forest filled with dripping leaves and long beams of golden light that slipped between the branches. Across the settlement, diagnostic lights continued blinking on the sleek research platforms, while maintenance drones quietly circled their towering frames. Nothing had failed catastrophically, yet nothing had behaved exactly as their designers had promised. The stabilization systems had spent enormous amounts of energy fighting every movement the storm demanded. In contrast, the ancient tree still stood exactly where it had stood centuries before, and the small wooden home nestled within. Its branches looked as peaceful as it had at sunrise. Lysera remained beneath the massive trunk long after the other inspectors returned to reviewing technical reports. Her scanner had already completed more than 4,000 structural calculations, but every conclusion ended with the same unresolved notation. Adaptive behavior exceeded predictive architecture. The phrase irritated her because architecture was supposed to eliminate uncertainty, not embrace it. Ethan appeared carrying 2 steaming enamel mugs, their surfaces scratched from years of use. He offered one without saying a word. Lysera hesitated for only a second before accepting it. The warm aroma surprised her. Cedar bark and mountain herbs. Local recipe, Ethan said with an easy smile. It helps after a storm. She studied the simple cup before taking a careful sip. The flavor was gentle, earthy, unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. Only the quiet rhythm of the forest filled the silence. Water dripped from high branches. Somewhere beyond the clearing, birds cautiously resumed their songs. The giant tree creaked softly as though stretching after a long breath. Finally, Lysera broke the silence. Why did you not reinforce the structure with stabilizers? Ethan rested one hand against the rough bark beside him. Because stabilizers would have fought the tree. She looked at him with genuine curiosity. Is that not their purpose? He smiled, searching the canopy overhead instead of looking directly at her. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop trying to win against nature. He watched a branch sway gently in the fading breeze. This tree has survived storms for hundreds of years. I have lived here for 4. It would have been arrogant to assume I knew more than it did. Lysra followed his gaze upward. The treehouse barely moved now, yet every beam remained perfectly aligned with the living trunk. Her training insisted that permanent structures should resist deformation. Everything around her suggested the opposite. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. When I was a kid, my grandfather told me something while we were building our first treehouse together. He never talked much about engineering. He simply said, if the tree wants to dance, let it dance. Build something that enjoys the music instead of trying to silence it. Lysra quietly repeated the words inside her mind. Build something that enjoys the music. They sounded almost childish, yet the evidence surrounded her in every direction. Every advanced platform nearby had spent the storm resisting motion. Every calculation had demanded control. This humble structure had accepted movement instead, turning every gust into part of its design. She slowly walked onto the wooden bridge, feeling it flex almost imperceptibly beneath her feet. Instead of feeling unstable, it felt alive. Warm cedar released its fragrance beneath the afternoon sun, while faint scratches in the handrail hinted at years of small hands sliding along its surface. For the first time, Lysra noticed details no scanner had ever highlighted. The railing was slightly lower where children naturally rested their arms. The windows framed sunsets instead of perfect geometric symmetry. Every corner seemed shaped by people rather than algorithms. She looked back toward Ethan. You designed this for efficiency, did you not? He chuckled softly and shook his head. No, I designed it so children would remember how this place felt long after they grew up. The answer lingered in the quiet air long after neither of them spoke again, because somewhere deep within the silence, one of the greatest architects in the galaxy had begun to wonder whether memories might be a stronger building material than steel. That evening, the inspection vessel remained suspended above the forest like a quiet second moon, its observation deck glowing softly against the darkening sky. Inside, dozens of holographic models rotated through the air as architects compared every structure they had examined during the past 2 days. Equations unfolded across transparent displays. Environmental simulations expanded and collapsed in seconds. Yet every discussion kept returning to the same impossible question. Why had the simplest structure produced the most unpredictable results? Lysra stood alone before an enlarged projection of the treehouse. She magnified every beam, every rope joint, every wooden brace that Ethan had shaped by hand. Nothing appeared extraordinary in isolation. The lumber was local. The connections were uncomplicated. The geometry even violated several accepted galactic principles of permanent construction. Still, the complete system behaved with remarkable elegance. She initiated another simulation. Strong winds swept through the digital forest. The tree bent naturally. The treehouse followed. Energy dispersed across hundreds of tiny movements instead of concentrating into destructive force. She repeated the experiment using advanced composite alloys, rigid supports, and conventional stabilization fields. Every version consumed significantly more energy while producing greater structural stress. The room grew unusually quiet. One senior analyst folded his arms. There must be hidden technology embedded within the wood. Another shook his head. Every scan confirms natural material. No concealed systems. No active processors. No adaptive machinery. Lysra lowered the simulation speed until each movement became almost imperceptible. Then she noticed something everyone else had overlooked. The treehouse was never behaving as a separate building. It behaved as one additional branch of the tree. Every connection respected the natural growth of the trunk instead of interrupting it. Every support accepted tiny seasonal changes instead of preventing them. The structure was not simply attached to nature. It had entered into a partnership with it. She quietly spoke before anyone else could. We have been analyzing a building. We should have been analyzing an ecosystem. Several architects turned toward her. She expanded the projection to include the surrounding forest. Root systems stabilized the hillside. Rainwater followed carefully preserved drainage paths. Sunlight reached lower vegetation because Ethan had intentionally left open spaces between platforms. Birds nested safely above the roof, while climbing vines naturally reinforced shaded sections during warmer months. Even the vegetable gardens below benefited from leaves that collected moisture before releasing it slowly into the soil. Nothing functioned independently. Every element strengthened another. One younger architect frowned. That level of integration cannot be standardized across multiple planets. Lysra looked at him calmly. Neither can a forest. That has never prevented forests from thriving. Silence settled across the chamber. Outside the observation windows, stars slowly emerged above the endless canopy, while the settlement below glowed with warm amber lights instead of brilliant industrial illumination. The colony seemed smaller than ever from this height, yet somehow more complete. Lysra remembered Ethan's quiet words beneath the ancient tree. A home should lower your heartbeat before it raises your productivity. At first, she had dismissed the sentence as sentiment rather than engineering. Now she wondered whether generations of galactic architects had measured every meaningful thing except the one quality people actually remembered after returning home. She requested one final comparison. Display the highest-rated residential habitat ever certified by the Galactic Habitat Authority beside Ethan Walker's treehouse. 2 images floated side by side. One represented centuries of technological perfection. The other had been built with cedar, rope, patience, and an understanding of children. Every architect studied them without speaking. The advanced habitat appeared flawless. The treehouse somehow felt welcoming. For the first time in the long history of the authority, an uncomfortable possibility entered the room. Perhaps architecture had spent thousands of years perfecting buildings while humanity had quietly remembered how to build places where life itself wanted to stay. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale mist that drifted quietly through the towering forest like slow-moving clouds searching for the ground. Dew shimmered across every wooden railing of the treehouse, catching the first rays of sunlight until the entire structure glowed with a gentle warmth that no artificial lighting could imitate. Children had not yet arrived, leaving the forest unusually peaceful except for distant birds and the occasional rustle of leaves high above. Ethan Walker sat on the front porch with a notebook resting across one knee, sketching ideas for an additional reading platform that overlooked a nearby creek. He never drew perfect lines. Instead, he drew possibilities, allowing the shape of the tree to decide the final design. Soft footsteps crossed the wooden bridge behind him. Without turning around, he smiled. "Good morning. I had a feeling you would come back." Lysra paused beside the railing, studying the unfinished sketches spread across the notebook. None of them followed precise geometric grids. Every drawing curved naturally around branches, sunlight, and empty spaces where future growth had been anticipated rather than prevented. "You are changing the design already," she observed. Ethan nodded. "The tree grew almost 3 inches this season. The house should grow with it." She looked up toward the massive trunk. "In my civilization, permanent architecture is expected to remain unchanged for thousands of years." Ethan closed the notebook gently. "Maybe that is why you have to keep repairing it." The answer was not spoken with arrogance. It sounded more like quiet curiosity. Lysra considered the thought while resting one hand against the warm cedar railing. During her entire career, she had celebrated buildings that defeated time through absolute rigidity. Yet standing here, she realized this little structure had chosen a different victory. It accepted change before change became a problem. Children slowly began arriving from different corners of the settlement, carrying books, blankets, and homemade breakfasts. Nobody treated the treehouse like an attraction. They treated it like home. One little boy stopped halfway across the bridge after noticing a loose pine cone resting beside the walkway. He carefully picked it up and placed it inside a small wooden basket attached to the railing. Ethan noticed Lysra watching. "We collect anything that could make someone trip. It takes 5 seconds. It might save someone else from falling." A young girl opened one of the windows before another child even reached for it. 2 brothers quietly rearranged cushions so an elderly neighbor could sit comfortably during story hour later that afternoon. Nobody had been instructed to perform these tiny acts. They simply happened. One thoughtful gesture inspired another until kindness became as ordinary as breathing. Lysra slowly realized that the treehouse was teaching something no blueprint had ever documented. The building itself encouraged people to care for one another. Its narrow bridge invited patience instead of rushing. Shared benches naturally brought strangers together. Open windows welcomed conversation instead of isolation. Even the smallest details quietly shaped behavior without demanding it. She turned toward Ethan with genuine fascination. You designed human behavior into the architecture. Ethan laughed softly before shaking his head. No, human behavior designed the architecture. I just paid attention. The sentence settled over the quiet porch more heavily than either of them expected. Every calculation inside Lysera's training insisted that buildings served occupants. Humanity appeared to believe the opposite was equally true. Places quietly shaped the people who lived within them. She looked once more across the peaceful forest where children laughed beneath ancient branches while sunlight filtered through thousands of living leaves. In that quiet morning, she understood something no academy had ever taught. Ethan had never built a treehouse. He had built a reason for neighbors to slow down, notice each other, and remember that every great community begins with someone making space for another person. As the forest awakened around them, Lysera felt the foundation of everything she believed about architecture begin to shift, not because of revolutionary technology, but because one ordinary human had remembered that the strongest structures were often the ones that quietly strengthened the hearts inside them. 3 weeks after the inspection concluded, Kestrel Ridge returned to its familiar rhythm. Morning fog drifted through the forest, children hurried across the wooden bridge before school, and Ethan Walker quietly expanded the reading platform exactly as he had sketched it. The Galactic Habitat Authority had already departed, leaving behind nothing except a courteous evaluation report and polite farewells. Life moved on. Then, just before sunrise on an unusually cool morning, every communication beacon across the settlement chimed at the same time. Colonists paused in kitchens, workshops, and gardens as emergency transmissions appeared on public displays. The images showed a distant colony world orbiting a fading orange star. Towering residential habitats stretched across steep mountain ranges, each one celebrated for generations as the pinnacle of galactic engineering. Yet something had gone terribly wrong. Decades of increasingly unstable climate cycles had transformed predictable seasonal winds into constantly shifting atmospheric currents. The magnificent habitats remained standing, but maintaining them now required more energy every month. Entire districts had become too expensive to operate. Families were slowly relocating as power shortages spread across the planet. The structures had survived. The communities inside them were quietly disappearing. Ethan watched the report without saying anything. He simply reached for another plank of cedar and continued smoothing its surface with slow, steady movements. A few hours later, another vessel descended into the clearing beside the forest. It was smaller than the original inspection fleet and carried only one passenger. Lysera stepped onto the soft grass without ceremony. She looked more tired than Ethan remembered. The calm confidence she always carried remained, but now it was accompanied by something new. Concern. She found Ethan replacing a weathered section of the porch railing. "You already knew I would return," she said with a faint smile. Ethan glanced toward the fresh lumber beside him. "You look like someone who had more questions than answers. Usually those people come back." For a brief moment, she almost laughed. Then her expression grew thoughtful again. "The colony you saw this morning was once considered the greatest residential achievement in our civilization. It received the highest architectural certification ever awarded." Ethan rested the finished railing in place before tightening the final wooden peg. "And now?" Lysera looked toward the towering tree above them. "Now families are leaving because the buildings demand too much from the people living inside them." The words lingered between them. Ethan brushed cedar shavings from his hands before speaking quietly. "A home should carry part of your burden. If you spend your whole life carrying the house instead, something has gone wrong." Lysera lowered her eyes for a moment. Those exact concerns had dominated emergency meetings across the authority during the past 2 weeks, yet no mathematical model had expressed the truth with such simple clarity. She reached into a small satchel and removed a thin crystal data tablet. Millions of design files rested inside it. Entire planetary cities. Centuries of accumulated knowledge. She placed it gently on the porch beside Ethan. "I presented your ecological principles to the Central Design Council." Ethan looked at the tablet, but did not touch it. "How did they respond?" Lysera inhaled slowly before answering. "They rejected every proposal. They declared your methods sentimental, inefficient, and impossible to standardize across advanced civilizations. The forest fell silent around them except for the gentle rustling of leaves high above. Ethan simply nodded once, almost as though he had expected the answer. What surprised Lysra was not his disappointment. It was his complete lack of anger. He picked up another unfinished piece of cedar and continued shaping it with careful hands. Wood curls drifted quietly onto the porch floor as sunlight filtered through thousands of green leaves overhead. Watching him, Lysra realized that while the greatest architects in the galaxy were debating theories inside magnificent chambers, one ordinary human had never stopped building places where people could simply belong. At that moment, she made a decision that would place her reputation, her career, and perhaps the future of galactic architecture on a path no council had authorized. 2 months later, the emergency colony orbiting the fading orange star welcomed its first experimental district, although almost nobody believed it would succeed. The project had not received the highest level of approval, nor had it been celebrated by the Galactic Habitat Authority. Instead, it moved forward under a temporary emergency authorization after every certified housing solution continued consuming more energy than the struggling colony could produce. Lysra accepted full professional responsibility for the outcome. If the district failed, her architectural license and career within the authority would end alongside the experiment. Some officials quietly referred to the district as Lysra's folly. Others called it the human experiment. Neither name appeared on the official construction records. The valley chosen for the project looked nothing like Kestrel Ridge. There were no ancient forests reaching toward the sky and no towering cedar trees waiting to embrace wooden platforms. Instead, gentle hills rolled beneath broad canopies of resilient native vegetation whose flexible trunks had evolved under centuries of shifting winds. Most architects wanted to remove the plants before construction began. Lysra refused. The landscape is part of the foundation, she calmly explained. We are not replacing it. We are joining it. Her engineers exchanged uncertain glances, but followed every instruction exactly. Buildings curved around existing root systems instead of cutting through them. Walkways bent naturally with the terrain instead of forcing perfect straight lines. Public gathering spaces faced sunrise and evening light rather than maximizing construction symmetry. Every apartment overlooked gardens, shared courtyards, or quiet green paths instead of endless walls. The structures themselves incorporated adaptive joints inspired by Ethan Walker's Treehouse, allowing them to move with seasonal environmental changes rather than resisting every natural force. Nothing about the district appeared extravagant. In fact, several visitors remarked that it looked surprisingly simple. That observation pleased Lysra more than any compliment could have. One full seasonal cycle passed. The changing winds arrived exactly as predicted, followed by heavy rains, bitter cold, and months of shifting temperatures. Older residential sectors immediately increased stabilizer output, while maintenance crews hurried between buildings making constant adjustments. Inside the experimental district, something remarkable happened. Energy consumption barely changed. The buildings shifted almost imperceptibly alongside the environment, dispersing stress through thousands of tiny movements instead of concentrating it into expensive correction systems. Engineers stared at live telemetry in disbelief. Structural fatigue remained negligible. Maintenance requests dropped dramatically. Even more surprising were the social reports arriving from local administrators. Families spent longer hours in shared outdoor spaces. Children preferred walking instead of remaining indoors. Elderly residents reported sleeping more peacefully despite the unpredictable weather. Community gardens expanded without official planning because neighbors simply began planting together. Neighborhood disputes gradually declined. Volunteer participation steadily increased, and requests to relocate into the experimental district rose with every passing month. During one quiet evening, Lysra walked alone through the central courtyard as warm lights glowed beneath gently swaying branches. She watched 2 children helping an elderly resident carry baskets of fresh vegetables while nearby musicians played soft melodies beneath an open pavilion. Nobody noticed the architecture. They noticed each other. She smiled as Ethan's words quietly returned. A home should carry part of your burden. Around her, the buildings were doing exactly that. After reviewing a full year of operational data, the Central Design Council reconvened. This time the chamber felt very different. There were no polite smiles, no dismissive laughter. Every delegate studied the newest reports in complete silence. Resource consumption had fallen beyond every projection. Resident satisfaction had reached historic levels. Maintenance costs continued declining with each passing season. One senior council member slowly looked up from the data. Who developed these principles? Lysera paused before answering. The room waited. She could have claimed the discovery. She could have accepted the recognition that every architect secretly desired. Instead, she spoke with quiet certainty. An ordinary human frontier. Engineer named Ethan Walker reminded me that buildings exist for people, not the other way around. No one responded immediately. Outside the towering crystal windows, countless stars shimmered across the darkness. Inside the chamber, centuries of architectural certainty began yielding to a single uncomfortable truth. The greatest innovation in modern galactic design had not come from a laboratory, an academy, or a council. It had begun with a small wooden treehouse where one human had simply asked how a child might remember feeling safe. Years passed so quietly that Ethan Walker never noticed history changing around him. Kestrel Ridge remained exactly what it had always been. Children still raced across the wooden bridge before breakfast. Families still gathered beneath the enormous tree for evening stories. Every spring the treehouse grew a little differently because the living branches continued reaching toward the sun, and every spring Ethan quietly adjusted another railing, another window, another beam, so the house could continue growing alongside the forest instead of standing against it. He never submitted another proposal to the Galactic Habitat Authority. He never traveled to the great capitals of the stars. As far as he knew, he had simply built one good place for one small community. Nearly 12 light years away, the first experimental district became 5. 5 became 30. 30 became entire cities. Within a decade, every major planetary development commissioned by the Galactic Habitat Authority began following a new architectural philosophy known simply as living integration. Towering residential habitats no longer rose as monuments separated from their worlds. They curved around rivers instead of redirecting them. Public gardens occupied the center of every neighborhood instead of leftover space. Buildings flexed gently with seasonal change. Shared balconies replaced isolated observation decks. Walkways encouraged neighbors to meet naturally rather than merely pass each other. Energy consumption fell across hundreds of colonies. Maintenance costs declined year after year. More importantly, something impossible to measure with scanners quietly spread from world to world. People lingered outdoors long after sunset. Families gathered more often. Children wandered gardens and woodland paths instead of remaining indoors. Elderly citizens once again became familiar faces instead of forgotten names behind closed doors. Architects eventually discovered that communities requiring fewer repairs often began with buildings that encouraged people to care for one another long before maintenance crews ever arrived. The greatest surprise came 20 years after Lysera's first visit to Earth colony Kestrel Ridge. The Galactic Habitat Authority announced the largest construction initiative in recorded history. New transportation hubs, educational centers, residential districts, research campuses, diplomatic complexes, and orbital habitats would all be redesigned under one unified architectural standard. When the official presentation appeared across thousands of worlds, every delegate expected to see elegant crystal towers or revolutionary energy systems. Instead, the first image filling the enormous screen was a simple wooden treehouse resting inside the branches of an ancient cedar. The chamber remained completely silent. Beneath the image appeared one sentence. Every great civilization begins by building a place where the next generation feels safe enough to dream. Beside the image rested Ethan Walker's original hand-drawn sketch, preserved in the Galactic Archive as the first document of the living integration movement. Lysera stood before the assembled council wearing the same white uniform she had worn on the day she first visited the frontier settlement. This time there was no hesitation in her voice. We once believed architecture existed to demonstrate our intelligence. Humanity reminded us that architecture exists to protect hope. After months of independent reviews, pilot evaluations, and votes across every regional authority, the new Galactic Living Standard was formally adopted. It became the foundation for every major construction project across known space. Several weeks later, an unmarked shuttle landed once again at Kestrel Ridge. Ethan found Lysera standing beneath the ancient tree exactly where they had shared cedar tea years before. She handed him a small wooden plaque rather than a medal. It had been carved from timber grown on a distant alien world using the same design principles he had taught without ever realizing it. On its surface were only a few carefully engraved words. First builder of the living galaxy. Ethan smiled gently before looking up into the familiar branches. I only built a treehouse. Lysera looked around as children laughed overhead, while sunlight danced across weathered cedar polished smooth by countless small hands. Then she slowly shook her head. No, you reminded an entire civilization what a home was supposed to feel like. As evening settled across the forest, the old tree swayed gently beneath a quiet breeze, just as it always had. Far above, thousands of starships crossed the darkening sky toward worlds where cities now curved around rivers, forests, and hills with the same quiet grace as Ethan's humble treehouse. Their graceful silhouettes echoed the design first imagined beneath these ancient branches, and for the first time in galactic history, the greatest architectural achievement in the stars was not measured by how high it reached, but by how many hearts it quietly brought together.